And you're from Canada.
Yeah.
One of the biggest phenomenon of the last couple of years has been Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
What have you made of him, his rise, and what it says about the culture that people are so thirsting for what he's talking about?
Peterson, first of all, is very bright, extraordinarily articulate, and in some ways a compelling speaker. So he's an attractive figure in some ways. When I read him, I sense a lot of suppressed rage in him. In fact, I think his voice is choking with rage a lot of the time. It's interesting because he talks about rage, that you have to deal with it. I don't think he understands just how angry he is. And if you look at his websites, the comments are full of rage by his young acolytes. Now that's an energetic thing. That it's his energy that draws people as much as what he actually teaches. Secondly, he teaches repression. I mean, he very rightly takes an issue where somebody mandates a certain kind of language, and he very rightly and righteously says that I will not be dictated to about what language I'm going to use. Well, good for him. I'm all in favor of not mandating language, on the one hand. On the other hand, he basically advocates repression. In his book, he talks about how an angry 2-year-old child needs to be sit by themselves until they get over it. Rather than understanding why a child would be angry at age 2, what frustrations they're having, and what human contact they need to help them move through that anger, he says repress the anger. So he's all about repressed anger as far as I'm concerned. And it's very interesting how he talks about children. He talks about little varmints and little monsters and so on. I know that's meant to be humorous, but it's also a certain way of thinking of the young human child. So fundamentally, I see him as an agent of repression. He posing as an agent of libertarianism. Not to mention, he's got this bee in his bonnet about what he considers to be, seems to consider to be conspiracies by left-wing intellectuals. They seem to be his bête noire. Being a left-wing intellectual myself, I like to talk to him sometimes. What are you so upset about, Jordan? What are you so afraid of? You know, he talks about these bloody Marxists. And he points out very accurately all the horror that occurred under so-called Marxist regimes, particularly in the Soviet Union. He's absolutely accurate about that. But then he promotes Christianity. Shall I tell him about the mass murders that occurred in the name of Christianity? Should I tell him about all the millions that were slaughtered in the names of the gentle Jesus? In other words, let's be fair about it. He seems to pick ideologies to attack and abhor and embrace other ideologies that are just as murderous in practice sometimes. It's a much more interesting question for me. What happened in Eastern Europe? How come under an ideology that was meant to liberate people, so many people were oppressed? I come from Eastern Europe. I was born in Hungary. He doesn't have to tell me about what it was like. But how about asking, how come a religious philosophy that was meant to promote love and acceptance and compassion has become such an agent of 2 millennia of repression, oppression, and killing? So can we be objective, or we're going to be simply tribal about it? I have a lot to say to Jordan, or a lot to, as much as I appreciate actually some of what he says, and as interesting as I find him, I think he's a very mixed figure, largely an agent of repression. But now what you said about Jordan Peterson, his teaching comes down to individual responsibility. Now, individual responsibility is important. Mm-hmm. We should all be responsible for our lives. But is the aforesaid Aboriginal child who's been historically traumatized and continues to be discriminated against socially, and his chances of being incarcerated are so much greater, can we just expect him to be as responsible as a privileged white male brought up under very comfortable circumstances? Or do we need to actually look at the social basis of responsibility?
Can we not do both?
We can do both, but we can't ignore either one.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So and he does. That's the first point. The second point is his essential message is, yeah, you got to take responsibility, but then what is it? We don't look at what is it that makes it difficult people to take responsibility. And what makes it people to take responsibility is lack of consciousness, lack of awareness. And in the way of awareness, in the way of consciousness, is precisely trauma. And the third point about him is that his advocacy is for parents to bring up kids that fit into society. And so parents now become social agents of conformity, basically, in his teaching. And basically, you better make your kids into people that you will like, because otherwise society won't like them. Well, that's one view of child rearing. Another view of child rearing is that the purpose of child rearing is to help people develop the individual potential, their full freedom, their full capacity for independent thought, their connection to themselves, regardless of what society might think of that.
Well, I think...
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you just because I didn't answer your question, and I realize I'm interrupting. The question of why he's a focal point for so much. He says true things, and he is very articulate and a very astute debater. But there's always a subtext. There's the text and there's the subtext. And the text, he's very good at defending and articulating the text. But what is the subtext? There's a kind of anger in him. There's a kind of disdain for him, for people who challenge the social structure. There's a attacking energy in him. He's always seeing conspiracies of Marxist intellectuals who are out to get him. Well, I'm a Marxist intellectual. I'm not out to get him. I just don't agree with him. And I think he represents a socially retrograde political tendency, and he speaks to people's frustration and their repression. That's the subtext that I pick up on, and I can't prove that, but on a gut level, I really see it. And of course, if I parsed his writing, I could give you more examples, but I'm telling you, that's my sense of the guy.